Welcome to Layers of Communication with your host, Lydia Taggart. Life presents experiences that add layers to who we are and how we see the world, affecting how we communicate. Lydia is here to take apart the layers and create new ways to connect and build relationships. So now, please welcome the host of Layers of Communication, your core boss, Lydia Taggart.
Hi, I'm Lydia Taggart, your host for Layers of Communication on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. We're accepting your calls today. We're happy to talk with you. The number is 1-866-451-1451. Today we're going to talk about trauma. Everybody has some sort of trauma in their lives, and it's unique to each of us, depending on how we see it, how we view it. But it's one of those layers that's really easy for us to get stuck in. So I'm really excited to talk about this today and how to get through the layer of trauma and what we can do with it. One of my traumas, of course, is having quadruplets. And I know that's not what most people don't go through the trauma of quadruplets. But almost everyone has to deal with the trauma of death. And I remember the most traumatic death that I experienced in my life was my brother. And he had cancer. He had colon cancer. He was young. He was only about 30 or so, 32 maybe. And we'll talk about numbers later because I don't remember numbers that well. But I was at his house, and he was in his bed, and he literally sat up and looked at me just before his spirit left his body. And I remember that look in his eyes. It was not at all the same as like you get the look of death from your mom or something. You're like, oh no, she caught me snatching a cookie. It was not at all that kind of look of death. And my mom, in all her wisdom, framed that so that it was better for me to deal with. She said that he loved me so much that I was the last thing that he wanted to see before he left this life. And I was. And what a blessing it is to be able to reframe our situation so that it's a good thing instead of a scary, horrible thing that could have gone really bad for me in my life. But it didn't, because now, my mom was so wise in choosing her words at that moment. I recognize that look of death in other places too. We have chickens. We have pet chickens. And I know that sounds kind of silly for a lot of you because pets are supposed to be dogs or cats, right? But chickens are what we could have because we have allergies and different things. And my oldest son, who has Asperger's, was really, really connected to this one chicken. We named her Sally, but we nicknamed her Gimpy because she had hurt her foot. And she limped along for a long time. And we thought that everything was great and wonderful. But one day she had this look in her eyes. And it was pretty traumatic for my son. A lot of people think, well, it's just a chicken. Like it cost less than $2 to buy this poor little chicken that became such a loved pet. He would sit on the swings with her. He would carry her around just like a pet, like a real pet, not just a chicken. But other people who hadn't seen that connection, hadn't seen how important that chicken was to him, it didn't resonate the same for them. They're like, oh, well, what are you having for dinner? Barbecued or grilled, And sometimes we feel like our whole life has just crumbled because of the trauma that we're going through. And other people don't see and recognize it as such. They think that it's not a big deal because they don't know what our layers are, how we're seeing through our life, our experiences with that trauma, and how we redirect our thoughts in regards to that. So my intention today is for you to know that you are not alone. If we feel stuck in these situations, there's a way to get out of it. And we have a special guest here today to help us learn more about this, Annadel Lemon. She is the freedom warrior. owner of the Freedom Warrior Wellness in Bountiful, Utah. She's a mentor, keynote speaker, certified energy practitioner, and health coach. And true to form, Annadel is going to be leaving us a little bit early on this call so she can attend a funeral. She is an expert at helping free people from negative emotional trauma so they can clearly see their potential and step into greatness. She uses tried and true mentoring techniques and lessons learned along her own trauma journey to mentor others to success in business, health, and relationships. So I'm really excited for Annadel to come and help us through these layers and dealing with this. She has had a lot of experience with trauma. And like I said, she's on her way to a funeral as we speak. So, very, very much an expert in this field. Thank you for joining us, Annadel. Are you there?
Yes, thank you so much, Lydia. I appreciate it.
We really appreciate you being here today. So can you tell us a little bit about your story? How did you become an expert in overcoming negative emotional trauma?
Okay, well, I appreciate your intro because I love how you talked about not all of our trauma is huge or what some people would think would be a big deal. You know, the chicken to someone else is a huge trauma. You know, like you said, to me, it's the barbecue or something like that. But so I really appreciate that fact because when I tell my story, people are like, oh, well, I've not been through this kind of trauma, so this doesn't really relate to me. But it really does because any kind of trauma we have really affects us throughout our lives. When I was 15 years old, I was on my way to my friend's house. I had this friend who was the kind of friend where you would spend, a week at their house and they'd spend a week at your house. My mom was her mom was my mom, just a really great friend. December 30th, 1982, which dates me a little bit, but I was 15 years old and I was going to spend the night with my friend. And I was excited, and I see my mom standing at the door just waving all cute and everything. And in my mind, I thought I should go give her a hug. But then my sister was taking me. She's like, oh, we have to go. And so we just went. And I'm like, oh, I'll hug her later. So I go to my friend's house, and we're there doing the things that, teenage girls do, just hanging out and probably eating a bunch of junk food. But we decided that we're going to do the Jane Fonda workout tape. At the time, that was a big deal. With brand new tape, and we were doing this exercise program. We didn't have the leotards and the leg warmers, but we were still getting into it pretty good. So we're doing the grapevine, and we're doing this workout, and then it was about 10 o'clock at night, and there was a knock on her door. And, back then, people actually answered the door. They didn't hide and crawl across the floor like they went home. So we went, and, she opened the door. And in the doorway was a police officer, and he came to speak with me. And he told me to have a seat. He had something he needed to tell me. And so, at this point, I'm getting a little scared and nervous, and so I sit down, and he comes over, and he says, I need to tell you, your mother has been shot, and she did not survive. And we are looking for your father as the main suspect.
Oh, wow.
So as a 15-year-old, here I am. I've just lost my mother, and they've told us to stay away from the windows. They don't know if my father's dangerous. It did end up that in the morning he had put a hose from his tailpipe into his truck and committed suicide that way. So at that moment, I had lost both parents. I wasn't really close to my father, but I was close to my mother. Because he was quite a drinker, and so he was really never present for us. But I was close to my mom, and so at that moment I lost one of my best friends. And so as I looked back on this trauma and the way that I dealt with it, I realized that there were some things that I did even as a teenager that I didn't realize that I was doing until later on when I started learning more and going to learn how to overcome traumas and how to help people overcome, I realized what I had done at that point. So
Wow, that's even more traumatic than I thought. I've known you for a while and I didn't know that whole story. That's amazing. Let's learn more after this break. We're going to be taking a quick short break. This is Layers of Communication on the BBM Global Network in TuneIn Radio. I'm your host, Lydia Taggart. Welcome back to Layers of Communication on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. I'm your host, Lydia Taggart, and we are visiting with Annadel Lemon about trauma. Before the break, we were talking about how she dealt with her father murdering her mother and then committing suicide, and how devastating that could be. But then from that, the other experiences that came from that experience in her teenage world. And so we can relate this to ourselves a little bit easier, my son with his chicken who died, that he totally loved and was a pet for him. When other people didn't know how to react and they thought, well, it's just a chicken, that influenced how he dealt with that trauma. So Annadel, go ahead and tell us how you dealt with your trauma.
Well, one of the main things that I realized that I was doing at the time is, let me tell you this little story here. So later on, a few years later, I was on a date with this guy, and he was older than I was, but so he kind of was more understanding and aware sort of my situation. But he asked me, he said, how are you dealing with this so well? How are you able to overcome and just be, still be happy and still move on? And I thought about that for a second, and I said, well, I have gratitude for the situation, not gratitude that I lost my mother because I still missed her, not gratitude for the situation necessarily exactly, but I realized at that time that had this not happened to me in my life, I would not have been where I was. I found my religion, and at the time of my parents' death, I was dating a guy that probably wouldn't have gone in a very good direction. And I knew that there were blessings around that situation, and that there had to be something else in my life that I needed to do in order to take advantage of this situation. I wasn't completely aware at the time because I was probably 17 at this time, but I had that thought in the back of my head, there's gratitude here because I am where I am, and there's got to be more for me in this life. So that was the beginning of my understanding of the situation, is looking for the good and positive in the situation and the gratitude.
Wow, that's really incredible. Where do you think this idea of looking for more came from, instead of wallowing in the, oh no, poor me, my parents are both gone? And, there's so much, when we go through a trauma, I think that the real part of making it a trauma is the not understanding, maybe like some shock factor, of course, and wondering how we're going to move on and move forward. And that's really easy, I think, for people to get stuck in the, oh no, what am I supposed to do? I have no idea where to go from here. So where do you think that idea of looking for blessings came from for you?
To be honest, I don't know if it was just ingrained in me, and the fact that I knew there was possibly more that I needed to learn from the situation. But I feel like I had this great amount of coping ability to be able to see that, because as I look at that, I'm like, people don't normally have this kind of a thought right away. And so as I look back, that's one of the things I'm like, you know what, not everybody has this, but I can help them get through it by doing what I did. Because quite honestly, I don't really even know. I wasn't really religious then. I had, never went to church. I didn't, there was no prayer. There was nothing in my home like that. So to be honest with you, I don't really know. And I think to this day, it was such a blessing in my life that I was able to have those thoughts in my head, and I was able to be able to pull through it that way. And even the more I think about it now, the more I realize that this is my calling to help other people do this. And one of the reasons that I was able to have that gratitude and have the understanding that there was blessings around the situation. So I wish I had like some kind of idea that I could give you. Oh, here's why, but I really can't pinpoint it exactly, other than the fact that it was probably just a blessing from God to me.
Oh, I love that. We really are surrounded by blessings no matter where we are. We have what we need. I truly believe that. So thank you for sharing that. That's just really incredible.
Yeah.
So the next thing I want you to share about is, how did you deal with other people asking you how you're doing? Does that make sense?
Boy,
when
yeah,
people can approach you, and because a lot of times, for one, we don't know how to approach someone who's been through a traumatic experience. We don't know, but we want to let them know that we care about them and that we love them, that we're concerned for them, but we have no idea what to say to them. And often we just stick our foot in our mouth and make it more awkward, But how did you?
Right.
Yeah. So do you have
I
any advice about that?
I'm sorry, ask that again.
Do you have any advice about that for either side,
Okay.
if we're accepting people coming, or what we can say to someone and not make it worse?
Okay, so looking back at that time in my life, I don't really remember a lot about how I dealt with that part of it. I do remember one girl who, when I had to move schools because I went to live with my sister, she just flat out came up to me in kind of a rude way and said, did your dad kill your mom and then kill himself? I mean, kind of like that. And I'm just like, oh, well, yeah, I didn't really know how to deal with that. Some things I have learned, though, after the fact, another traumatic story in my life is just last May, I lost my first grandbaby after 6 hours. He lived 6 hours. And that, this is way more fresh for me, so I can get a little bit of understanding as to how people want to be approached, how my daughter wants to be approached. Really all people need to do is understand that something's happened and not ignore the person. So if you're friends with the person, even if you don't know what to say, for instance, with my daughter, she sometimes gets really upset because her friends don't speak to her as much as they used to, or they don't come around. And she said, all I really want is for them to reach out to me and say, how are you doing? And the other thing that's important is if you've lost a loved one, it's having other people mention their name. That's one thing she said to me, is if people would just ask me and say his name, just say, how are you doing? Atlas was such a beautiful boy, or whatever it was, just to have them mention the person, because it's really important to not have that person just pretend like have your friends pretend like it didn't exist, or pretend like your son never was around, or things like that. So mentioning it, and then sometimes just coming and sitting, just coming and making sure you're coming to the person who's grieving, and not expecting the grieving person to come to you, because sometimes they don't want to be out of that space.
Right. Very, very good points. Well, we'll continue learning more about how to approach people and be approached when we were dealing with a trauma after this short break. You're listening to TuneIn Radio and the BBM Global Network. I'm your host, Lydia Taggart, and this is Layers of Communication. We will be accepting your phone calls today at 1-866-451-1451, and we'll see you after this break. Welcome back. This is the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. I'm your host, Lydia Taggart, and this is Layers of Communication. We will be accepting your calls today at 1-866-451-1451. And if you have any questions or comments, or if you want to download the free ebook about time, please go to lydiataggart.com. Excuse me. We're talking with Annadel Lemon today about trauma and how to deal with trauma, and the importance of being there when someone that we care about has had a traumatic experience, a death of a loved one or something else. And for me, it was having the quadruplets. It is a very big example for me that when people, before we were out having friends, play dates, and doing all sorts of stuff. And then we had quadruplets, and people are like, wow, that's a lot of kids. I don't know how to deal with that, and it was kind of traumatic for everyone. And it rippled out that some of our friends didn't come around anymore. They didn't know how to handle that situation. And Annadel is sharing the same kind of thing happens when a death of a loved one, or like her grandbaby passed away recently. It's really vital that we still show up for the people that we care for. Even if we feel awkward and weird, just being there makes such a huge difference. And we don't have to say anything necessarily, just to be there. Is that what you're telling us, Annadel?
Right, because especially if you are afraid to say the wrong thing, which sometimes people do, and the grieving person is just like, wow, I can't believe you said that. But even though it maybe doesn't seem insensitive to the person saying it, but to the grieving person it can. So sometimes if you're concerned about what to say and what not to say, the best thing to do is just be there for the person and love them and sit with them and allow them to speak about their loved one. And don't really put too much pressure on yourself to say the right thing. Just be there for the person. And another important thing I wanted to point out is that right at first, you've got people who are coming and giving you food and all that kind of stuff for the first 2 weeks, but then after that, people kind of dwindle off. So as somebody who loves somebody who's lost someone in their life, it's really important, even down the road, even a year down the road, to say, hey, how are you doing? I was thinking about, in my case, Atlas today, and, things like that. So it's really important not to just forget about that person that you love who's lost someone, because we get on with our lives. We have things in our lives, but maybe once in a while, put a reminder in your phone, hey, call Kelsey because she, and talk to her about Atlas today, just maybe once a month or something like that, so that the person knows that they aren't forgotten. Because for the person who's lost someone, your life becomes a standstill, and you're wondering, how are these people just doing their regular life when my life has just came to a complete standstill? So acknowledging that you still are thinking about them is huge for someone who's had loss.
Right. And it's like the whole world goes on without you. And I think that's where people can spiral into depression and that separation from their old life and the people who used to be around. If they're not around all of a sudden, then that just really compounds a big problem there. So,
yeah, absolutely.
So you've got 3 things for us to start this process of overcoming the negative emotions with trauma. Would you tell us more about what's the first thing that we can do? Okay, so let me just preface this a little bit. Some people say, well, is it really this easy to do that and to get over trauma? Because one of the things that, that I tell people is that, they ask, well, is it just that easy just to get over trauma? No, it's not. It is difficult, but it's not impossible. And from my studies and from working with my clients and helping them overcome their trauma, I've come to the conclusion that victimhood is a bunch of BS. So you cannot, people get really angry. That's not something you say. People are victims. However, you can be, maybe the victim of a crime per se, but you don't have to continue living as a victim. You don't have to be and have that energy of a victim. You hear these women who say, I only attract these guys who are jerks, and I only, all this stuff. Well, when you're living as a victim, and that reflects out, and people will prey on that victimhood because they can feel that energy. I could have stayed as a victim and had that anger against my father, which I did for a few years, because that's normal, is to hold on to that anger for a time until you can start to heal that. But I didn't want to live in that space. So, one of the things that you can do is you can stand up to the person who has either harmed you in a way that is, a physical harm or something like that, or an emotional harm. And you can just basically say, you know what, I am taking back my power from you, and I'm not going to take this anymore. Today I take back my power and I own it. So that's one of the things that you can do. And some people say, well, is it really that easy? Is the process really that easy to just say that?
And really, it's not, but it's doable. So one of the first things that I tell people is to fall madly in love with yourself. So
that's a
energy
good one.
begets like energy. So if you love yourself and other people can love you, if you don't love yourself, it's that energy that you put out there, that victimhood. No one else is going to have an easy time to find the good in you if you can't find the good in yourself. So demand love and respect for yourself. Look yourself in the mirror. Look yourself in the eye. Tell yourself, I love you and I respect you, and give yourself compliments. I know that's very difficult for a lot of people to do because they think, well, that's weird. You're talking to yourself. Well, if no one else is saying nice things about you, then you probably should be the one saying nice things about yourself, don't you think?
Yes, I love that. We'll get to the number 3 of what we can do after this break. I'm Lydia Taggart, your host for Layers of Community. Stay close. Welcome back to Layers of Communication. I'm your host, Lydia Taggart, and this is the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. Your calls are welcome today at 1-866-451-1451. And of course, if you have any comments or anything you want to send to lydiataggart.com. We're visiting with Annadel Lemon today about trauma, and she was telling us the 3 things that we can do, the first 3 things to begin getting through the negative emotional part of being in a trauma. And before the break, she was sharing with us about how being a victim, that energy of I'm a victim, people can prey on that energy. So we want to take our power back and fall madly in love with ourselves. And Annadel, will you tell us more about that?
Yeah, that's one of the things that I love to teach people because I have such a passion for people getting out of that victimhood, because you cannot survive and you cannot succeed as a victim. You need to take that power back and live in your power. So the number one thing that's kind of combined is take your power back and fall in love with yourself. You have to be the one to tell yourself how amazing you are if no one else is doing it. And if you're living as a victim, probably people are not doing that because they see you as a victim. So you have to remind yourself and everyone else how amazing you are. And everybody needs to do that, even though they're like, oh, that's bragging. No, it's not, because we're all amazing creations from God. So that's my opinion. And number 1. Let me move on to number 2.
Yes, and I agree. I actually got stuck in that layer for a while that I was going to be selfish or prideful if I said that I was something good. And I didn't want to be seen as stuck up and snobbish, but it did trigger that victim mentality that I'm not good enough. And I had to go through that, telling myself that I was awesome. And I remember the day that I looked in the mirror and I had been telling myself, you pick one thing. I think it's easier if you just pick one thing to try and convince yourself that you're good at or whatever. So I was telling myself that I had beautiful eyes. And I remember the one day that I was like, oh, this is silly. Here I am again in the mirror telling myself that I've got beautiful eyes. And I'm going to do this again. And I looked in the mirror and I said, you have beautiful eyes. And it just hit me all of a sudden. I do have beautiful eyes. Wow. So I think just over time, even if we don't believe that we're awesome, or that we're beautiful, you can, over time, get past that and get out of the victimhood.
Right. And one of the other things that I tell people when I work with my clients, if they're telling me, well, I'm not worth it, or I'm not, I have to figure out why I think that I'm worth this, self-care or whatever it is. I say, well, how, because I'm kind of blunt sometimes. I say, how selfish are you to be a person that disses on one of God's creations? You are God's creation. What are you telling your creator when you say you're not good enough? So that's one of the blunt things I tell some of my clients.
Yes. Oh, and during that time, my husband, he looked at me one day and he's like, so you're telling me that I don't make good choices? And I was really shocked at that. And that's where my real change started happening, that I knew my husband loved me, and but how could he, And so this victimhood, how it ripples out and affects our other relationships, is really important to recognize that when we are taking care of ourselves and not being stuck in that victimhood, then it does affect how we relate to other people. And I think one of my favorite things is feelings are meant to be felt. Feel them and get through them so you can be on the other side.
Yeah, absolutely. So that actually leads right into number 2 when we talk about loving ourselves. Is number 2 is to take care of yourself. So part of self-love is being vigilant about taking the time to move daily and to put good things in your body, good food, lots of water. When we are living as that victim, when we're living in that low energy, we don't feel worthy of taking care of ourselves. And this is where people have a lot of health issues and things like that, is they don't feel worthy to be, to go to the gym, to take that time, or why should I take care of myself? This is where a lot of the weight issues come in too. People, they don't take that time to think that they're good enough or they're worth it to do that self-care. And so that's the second thing of loving yourself, is to take care of yourself.
Yes.
So, and then number 3, you want me to move into number 3 right now?
Yes. What's number 3?
Okay. Number 3, and this is one of the most powerful exercises that you can do, is to have a conversation with the person that caused you the trauma or pain. So if the person is no longer on this earth, it doesn't really matter. What I'd like to do is tell people to talk to a tree or something like that, because the tree is living. You ask the tree, is it okay if I speak to you as if you are so-and-so? Usually in your mind, the tree says, yes, it's fine. So when you are having this conversation, for instance, I had a conversation with my father. I was very angry, and I yelled, and I swore, and even if you're not a swearer, I swear you should probably swear at the tree when you're talking to somebody. It really is very therapeutic sometimes. If you need to kick it, if you need to get down on the floor like you're 2 years old and you're on the ground and throw a fit and just say how angry you are and just get all of those emotions out about why they hurt you, how you feel about it, and just really, really take that in and just absorb it and just get it out there on that tree, on that living thing. That's really, really important. However, the second step in this is way, way more important than just getting it all out. Once you've said all those horrible things to the tree, and you know what, rightly, maybe the tree deserved it, the person, /tree/person deserved it. However, the second thing is you ask them to apologize. You say, please forgive me for how I feel about you. So you ask that forgiveness piece. And that is so cleansing, because it's very, very difficult. It's not easy. You don't have to say it's okay what you did. However, the forgiveness is not for the person. It's for you. And that is one of the things that people say, I can't do that. I said, you have to do it. It is imperative to your healing. And so as you were finishing up that part of the conversation, you say, please forgive me for how I feel about you. And even say, I forgive you. And what I always say is, you tell the person, I'm going to meet you where you're at, because you know that some of these things probably didn't happen to you because that person was okay emotionally either. So whatever that person was dealing with their emotions, was taken out on you. And so as I dealt with these things with my father, there were layers that I had to deal with. I first had to have this conversation, because in the beginning, after a few years, I thought, you know what, I'm fine, whatever. But I think I had just kind of gotten over it, but I hadn't dug it out. So then I had this conversation. And then just a couple of years ago, I had another layer of understanding come from what I say, if I listen to my higher power, and usually my higher power speaks through other people to me, where I had someone tell me something. This person is very, very intuitive. I don't think he really knows that he is, but he is. He told me something that he felt about my father. And I'm like, wow, okay, that's just one more layer of that understanding that I can put towards my healing and my relationship with him, even though he's passed. And so there are layers, and it does take time.
Can you stay with us a little bit longer after this break? I'd really love to hear more about this, so we do need to go to a break. Can you stay with us a little longer?
Yeah, I have a few more minutes. I can, yep.
Okay, great. So after this break, we'll continue learning more about how key forgiveness is. You're listening to TuneIn Radio and the BBM Global Network. I'm your host, Lydia Taggart, and this is Layers of Communications. Welcome back to Layers of Communication on the BBM Global Network and TuneIn Radio. You can call in today at 866-451-1451. I'm your host, Lydia Taggart, and we are visiting today with Annadel Lemon about trauma. Just before the break, she was talking about how many layers she needed to get through to deal with her trauma of her dad murdering her mom and committing suicide. And she was talking about forgiveness. Annadel, can you tell us more about the forgiveness and what happens next?
Okay, so usually once you've gone through that process, gone through the forgiveness process, you will feel, sometimes people feel a little bit like, oh, I can't do that, or it's not complete. And so it sometimes needs to be done more than one time for yourself. And I think the most important thing you need to realize is that you're not doing it really for the other person, because the other person, you know, they may have still hurt you and you may still feel that pain, but it's really for you. It's really for you to be able to get through and move forward out of that victimhood and step into your success, because all of this really relates to your relationships, your health, and your business success. And if you cannot move through this trauma, it's very difficult for you to be able to find a success in any of those areas.
Yes, key point that it is for us, it's not for them. I don't know, it never makes a difference for the other person. And sometimes I think on the smaller traumas that feel traumatic to us, but other people don't think that they're that big of a deal, the other person who hurt us probably doesn't even know that they did anything. If we're extra sensitive to something, like, for example, this weekend I met someone who had a really bad relationship with their former spouse, and they had a baby who had died. And we're in this conversation, and people are talking about their families and whatever, and she was just really quiet and waiting her turn to talk, I thought. But it wasn't what she was doing. She was avoiding the topic. When I said, well, do you have family or kids? And she was very, very unhappy to talk about that idea because it was tender to her. And I could see that I put her back into that trauma, but it wasn't intentional by any means. You know, sometimes we do that. And if we can forgive the other people, it's really for us to be able to have a conversation with somebody in that instance. If she had forgiven and been able to move through these processes, then she would be able to have a conversation with me. But at this point, she's not, right? So it's so important that we recognize that forgiveness is not going to release them from their consequences or anything like that either. It's just for us. It's purely just for us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I can see how that relates in everyday conversation, just with other people, and to see how that can relate to your business or other things too. It's incredible. So after we've forgiven the person, what's the next thing that we can do?
Well, the main thing you can do is just try and continue to have these conversations, because it's not just with the one person we probably should be having conversations with. It's anyone in our lives who we feel has hurt us, or even if we've hurt them, or if it's someone who's passed that you didn't get a chance to have a conversation with, you can also use this in that, because just the one person that has caused you the most trauma is really not the only person that you need to have this conversation with. One other thing I did want to point out is if the person is still living, you mentioned that they may not even know that they've done anything wrong. So you don't necessarily need to have this conversation with the living person to their face. And I wouldn't necessarily recommend it unless it's something that they need to know about. I had a client that she had to speak something to her husband. And I said, do not tell him to his face. What did she do? She did it anyway. It caused a lot of problems for a few weeks with them because it wasn't something that he needed to know. It wasn't something that he even knew that he had done or how it was still affecting her. And so I really cautioned against it, and she didn't listen, and she did it, and it really can cause problems in a relationship that the problems don't need to be there. So that's just a word of caution.
Okay, so tell us more about this tree taking place of the person.
Okay, so the reason I like to use the tree, and you don't have to because I've done this in my car while I'm driving also, but the reason I like to use a tree is because a tree is a living thing, and it does have, everything has energy, but something living has a different vibration. And so it kind of helps with the cleansing process. It's not necessary. And like I said, I've done it in my car, and it works just the same. So it doesn't really need to be, okay, I have to go use a tree. You can use it, do whatever you need to do in order to cleanse your feelings and your emotions.
Okay, thank you so much for helping us with this today, Annadel. Tell us where our listeners can find you.
Okay, you can go to my website. It's thefreedomwarrior.com, thefreedomwarrior.com. And you can also go and you can email me at Annadel, ANNADEL, at thefreedomwarrior.com. And I also have a book coming out early spring, if you're interested in that. I can tell you a little bit more about that if you have time.
Well, we do have to go to a break, so I'm not going to be able to have that time now, but thank you so much. We'll talk, maybe can have you back again and talk more in depth on this and your book.
Okay.
Great. Thank you. You're listening to Tune In Radio on the BBM Global Network. I'm your host, Lydia Taggart. This is Layers of Communication. Welcome back to the BBM Global Network and Tune In Radio. I'm your host, Lydia Taggart, and this is Layers of Communication. Today we've been visiting with Annadel Lemon about trauma and how to deal with trauma. She had probably the most traumatic thing that I could ever imagine, with her father murdering her mother and then committing suicide when she was a teenager. And some of the things that she shared with us were just be there for the person. Just be there. You don't have to worry about what to say. And I'm reminded of this story of a little boy who went out and they were looking for the most, the most friendly or helpful kid or something like that. Anyway, his neighbor was an older man and he had lost his wife. She had died. And people were trying to give him his space and not bother him too much and whatever. And so this little boy sees the old man sitting on the porch next door, and he goes over and sits down with him. And his mom was worried, she's like, oh no, he's going to be bothering him and whatever. So when the little boy came back a little while later, she asked him, what did you say to him? What can you say to someone who has lost a loved one? That's always the question that we worry about, right? We don't know how to approach someone who's been through a traumatic experience. We don't know how to relate to them. We feel so sad for them, and we don't know how to make it better. So as humans, we want to fix something, and it doesn't always necessarily need to be fixed. So the little boy says, I didn't say anything. I just helped him cry. And that's one thing that is so important, to take that pressure off of ourselves so we don't have to worry about what we say or what they need to hear. We just need to be there for that person, to keep them out of that spiral of depression if the world is changing and going crazy and we get stuck in this trauma. The way to help someone come out of that trauma is to just be there for them. We also talked about forgiveness and how important it is to forgive for ourselves. It doesn't make the consequence or the person who's wronged us any different. It's for us to be able to move forward. So that is really, really key to forgive fully, feeling the emotions. Feelings are meant to be felt. We need to feel them, move through them so we can get on to the other side and not worry about, is it okay to be angry? Of course it's okay to be angry. Anger is an emotion that's given to us on this earth for a reason. We need to not be stuck in that feeling and forgive and get through it. Next week, we're going to be excited to have on our show. Who are we having next week? Let's find out who we're having next week. It's going to be Julie May, How to Communicate with a Spouse That Doesn't Like to Talk. So we're excited for that. You can find me at lydiataggart.com, and I look forward to talking to you next week here on the BBM Global Network on TuneIn Radio. I'm your host, Lydia Taggart, and this is Layers of Communications. Have a great week. We'll see you next time.
You've been listening to Layers of Communication with your host, Lydia Taggart. Tune in next week as we break through the layers in order to communicate and connect down to your core on Lydia Taggart's Layers of Communication.